The sun dipped low over the plains of New Mexico in 1892, painting red willow in shades of gold and shadow. Dust stirred in the wind, rustling the empty porches and whispering through narrow alleys. The town seemed quiet, yet tension lingered in every creak of a board and distant coyote's howl. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, hunched over his tired horse. Dust clung to them both, proof of miles traveled. He carried more than weariness. His heart bore scars no one could see. Years of loss and solitude had taught him caution, but also a quiet hope that something awaited him here. He guided his horse toward the small boarding house at the town's edge. The air seemed to pause, as if the land itself was waiting. Here, destinies would collide, and hearts could begin to heal. If you love stories of quiet courage, human connection, and hope even in harsh places, follow Dust and Devotion Tales and join these journeys. He spent the first morning walking the quiet streets of Red Willow, taking in the cracked wooden signs and sun-bleached facades. Every corner held a memory of someone who had passed through, and every shadow reminded him of how long he had been running. The boarding house was modest, with peeling white paint and a small stable out back. He tethered his horse and stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his boots. The scent of warm bread and stew drifted from the kitchen, comforting and domestic in a way that made him pause. A young woman moved silently among the tables, clearing dishes and setting bowls. Her hair caught the morning light, pale strands like dry wheat, and her movements were careful, deliberate. She did not notice him at first, or perhaps she did and chose to remain distant. Her eyes carried a quiet strength, but beneath it a hidden pain that made him tense without understanding why.
He found a place at the edge of the room, letting the ordinary sounds of the kitchen fill the air. The old merchant and a few travelers spoke quietly among themselves, their words washing over him. Yet his attention kept returning to the woman. There was a stillness in her that was both captivating and sorrowful, a story hidden behind guarded eyes. After the others had left, he lingered. He found a basin by the window and began helping with the dishes. The rhythm of washing and drying, of warm water and clinking porcelain was grounding. For the first time in years, he felt present in a way that did not demand vigilance or fear. As the sun climbed higher, he studied her silently. He noticed the faint bruise on her wrist and the way her shoulders seemed to bear an invisible weight. He realized that her quiet strength was born of survival, that every motion carried a memory he could only guess at. And he knew, without fully understanding how, that staying in Red Willow might change everything.
Days passed quietly in Red Willow, each one blending into the next, measured by small tasks and routine. Elijah repaired the broken step on the boarding house porch, mended sections of the stable fence, and chopped firewood for the kitchen stove. The rhythm of work grounded him in a way he had not felt for years, a steadying presence against the chaos of his past. She moved through the boarding house with careful precision, attending to chores that seemed simple but carried weight in their repetition. Her movements were deliberate, as if each step were measured against some unseen standard. He watched her, noting the way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ears, the quiet sigh that escaped her lips when she thought no one was looking, the way her hands lingered over worn surfaces, as though seeking reassurance in their solidity. Elijah began to follow the patterns of her day, learning the small routines that governed her life. He brought in firewood while she set the table, carried water while she cleaned dishes, swept the floor as she arranged pans and bowls. Their tasks began to overlap, forming an unspoken rhythm, a silent choreography that required no words, but built trust in its own quiet way.
He noticed her subtle gestures, the slight flinch when doors slammed, the way she paused mid-motion as though listening for something unseen, the careful manner in which she avoided drawing attention to herself. Slowly, he began to piece together fragments of her story, understanding that her guardedness was born of pain, a burden carried long before he arrived. Evenings were quieter. After the chores were done, he would sit on the porch and watch the desert stretch toward the distant hills, the wind carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. Occasionally she would pass by, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before dropping back to the ground. In those fleeting encounters, he saw glimpses of fear, resilience, and a cautious hope that mirrored his own. He thought about what it meant to stay, to remain in a place without pressing onward, to stand in one spot long enough to notice the small, fragile details of someone else's life. And with each passing day, he felt a subtle shift within himself. He was no longer just a drifter seeking shelter. He was a man beginning to care, beginning to notice, and beginning to hope that he might be able to protect what mattered most. The town remained quiet, the desert indifferent. Yet between the two of them, a fragile connection began to form. In shared silences and small gestures, in the gentle exchange of glances and the rhythm of daily work, something unspoken took root, a sense that perhaps together they could face the shadows of the past, one steady step at a time. The days in Red Willow passed with an uneasy rhythm. Elijah noticed subtle changes in the town, shadows stretching longer in the evenings, the distant echo of hooves at odd hours, and the way strangers' eyes lingered too long on the boarding house. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a warning that the past was stirring, that trouble might arrive sooner than he expected. Clara moved with her usual careful grace, but now there was a new tension in her steps, a vigilance that had not been there before. She listened at doors, glanced over her shoulder more often, and held the keys to the boarding house tighter in her hand. Elijah saw it, understood it, and allowed himself to prepare for what might come. He knew he could not protect her from everything, but he could stand beside her. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the hills, a rider appeared on the horizon, the figure silhouetted against the dying light. Elijah's heart tightened. The rider's slow, deliberate approach carried the weight of authority and menace. The townsfolk noticed too, their whispers carrying across the dusty streets, and Elijah's hands clenched at his sides. He could see the shadow of a man who demanded control, someone who believed the world owed him obedience. Inside the boarding house, Clara sensed it before he could speak. She moved quietly, checking the locks, drawing curtains, and moving closer to Elijah without a word. They shared a glance heavy with understanding. Both knew that the past she had fled from might finally be closing in, that the fragile sense of safety they had built could shatter in an instant. Elijah spent the night walking the perimeter of the property, the desert air sharp and biting, his mind racing with strategies and contingencies. Every distant sound, every rustle of wind in the sagebrush made him tense. He thought of the man who had hurt Clara, the cruelty hidden behind charm, the violence that had forced her to flee. And he knew that when confrontation came, there would be no room for hesitation. Clara, unable to sleep, sat near the window, her hands folded, tracing patterns on the worn wood. Memories she had tried to bury returned with clarity. The nights of fear, the sound of doors slamming, the weight of his fists. Yet, alongside the fear, a quiet determination began to grow. She was no longer alone,
and the presence of Elijah gave her a courage she had not felt in years. By morning, the tension had thickened. The rider was still out there, a looming presence, and the town seemed to hold its breath. Every movement outside the boarding house became significant, every distant hoofbeat a signal. Elijah and Clara moved with silent coordination, preparing for the moment when the threat could no longer be avoided, their bond solidifying in the face of what was to come. The morning air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Elijah moved quietly around the boarding house, checking the stable and the fences, every motion deliberate and measured. He could feel the presence of the approaching danger, a shadow that seemed to stretch across the town before the rider had even arrived. Clara watched him from the window, her pulse quickening, heart pounding in sync with the thrum of fear and anticipation. They spent the day preparing silently. Elijah repaired loose boards, sharpened knives, and stacked firewood with meticulous care. Clara collected provisions, hiding them in places only they knew, her hands steady but her mind restless. Every creak of the floor, every rustle outside drew her attention, and she realized that the sense of safety they had cherished was fragile, like glass suspended on a thread. As dusk approached, the first signs of trouble appeared. Dust swirled on the horizon, and Elijah's eyes narrowed at the sight of two riders approaching the town. Their gait was purposeful, unhurried, but inexorably moving toward the boarding house. Clara pressed a hand against the window, her stomach tightening. She no longer doubted what was coming. The past had found her, and it was determined to reclaim its hold. Elijah stepped outside to meet them, his presence steady and commanding. Every instinct he had honed over years of wandering guided him now. The riders slowed as they neared, and Elijah could see the look in their eyes: expectation, authority, and a coldness that spoke of men accustomed to obedience. He felt the weight of responsibility for Clara settle heavier on his shoulders, and he braced himself for confrontation. The air between them was taut, charged, almost unbearable. The townsfolk peered from behind curtains, their whispers carried on the wind. Clara stayed inside, close to the door, ready to act, but trusting Elijah to hold the line. The riders exchanged a brief, tense glance before one of them dismounted, slowly, boots scraping the dusty ground. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant call of a crow and the low wind sweeping across the open fields. Elijah's eyes met those of the approaching man, and in that moment, the stakes were clear. The threat was no longer distant, no longer abstract. It had come to the very steps of the boarding house. And yet, beneath the fear, there was resolve. Both he and Clara had been shaped by survival, by flight and vigilance. They were ready, together, to face whatever the evening would bring. As the sun sank behind the hills, the shadows lengthened, wrapping the town in a muted, uncertain darkness. Every sense was heightened, every sound magnified. The confrontation was inevitable, and both Elijah and Clara felt the fragile line between hope and fear tighten. And in that quiet, tense moment, a bond strengthened in shared vigilance, in silent courage, and in the promise that they would face what came as one. Night had settled over the town, draping the streets in shadow and quiet tension. The boarding house seemed smaller, vulnerable, surrounded by the dark expanse of the prairie. Elijah moved through the rooms with deliberate care, checking each window, each door, his hands steady but his mind alert. Clara followed closely, carrying what supplies they might need, her steps soft but determined. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through the shutters made her heart skip. Outside, the riders paused at the edge of the town, their horses restless, nostrils flaring in the cool night air.
The larger figure of their leader surveyed the streets, calculating and patient, as though he knew that the waiting would increase the tension, force fear to take root. Elijah watched from the porch, his jaw tight, every muscle ready. He could feel Clara's presence behind him, a quiet anchor, and it strengthened his resolve.
The first sound broke the night, a single, deliberate knock at the door. Elijah's hand rested on the revolver at his hip, calm and precise. Clara's breath caught, but she did not move, trusting his judgment. Another knock, firmer this time, reverberated through the wooden frame. The townsfolk whispered from darkened windows, sensing that something long feared had arrived. Elijah stepped forward, each motion controlled, measured, showing no hesitation. The door swung open under the rider's insistence. Shadows stretched long across the room as the threat entered, menacing yet restrained by the weight of Elijah's presence. Time seemed suspended, each heartbeat loud, echoing in the silence. Clara watched,
The confrontation stretched across the porch, tense and fragile. Every motion was deliberate, every glance carrying unspoken warning. The leader's hand hovered near a weapon, testing, measuring. Elijah's fingers rested lightly on the grip of his revolver, ready but patient, his mind calculating. Clara felt the strain in the air, yet beneath it a thread of hope, a recognition that courage and loyalty might tip the balance. Hours seemed to pass in the brief exchange of glances, each man asserting presence without words, until the first signs of surrender appeared. The threat hesitated, recognizing that control had shifted. Elijah's patience and unyielding stance, combined with the quiet strength radiating from Clara, broke the tension in a single fragile moment. Slowly, the intruders retreated, leaving the town and the boarding house in silence. Inside, Elijah exhaled, the weight of the night settling into his shoulders. Clara stepped to his side, and without words, they shared a glance that carried relief, exhaustion, and an unspoken promise. The danger had passed, but the bond forged in the shadow of fear had deepened. Together, they moved through the quiet house, tending to small tasks, preparing for the dawn, knowing that survival and courage had created a foundation for something new. The first light of dawn painted the prairie in soft gold and rose, spilling warmth across the quiet town. The boarding house, once a place of tension and fear, now felt alive with the subtle energy of hope. Elijah stepped onto the porch, feeling the cool breeze and the gentle hum of the waking town. Clara joined him, her eyes reflecting the rising sun, carrying the quiet strength she had discovered within herself during the long nights of uncertainty. Together, they walked through the small garden behind the boarding house, where wildflowers swayed in the morning wind, their colors bright against the earth. The work they had done over the weeks, repairing fences, tending the kitchen, managing the stables, felt like more than chores. It was the rhythm of a new life, a life built carefully, with patience and shared effort. Each small gesture, each quiet smile, wove them closer together, stitching trust into the fabric of their days.
Observed Clara as she paused to touch a flower, her hand lingering over its petals. He felt the intensity of the past nights, the dangers they had faced, dissolve into a gentle certainty. The memory of fear and the shadow of those who had sought to harm them lingered faintly, but it no longer held power over their hearts. Clara turned to him, her expression soft yet resolute, and he knew that in this moment they were choosing each other completely, without hesitation. The day unfolded around them slowly, with ordinary tasks made extraordinary by the presence of shared courage and mutual respect. They repaired the porch railing together, stacking the worn wood with care. They tended the horses, brushing away the dust of travel and worry, feeling the steady rhythm of life returning. Each gesture, each shared laugh, carried the promise of something enduring, a foundation stronger than fear. Climbed higher. Elijah and Clara stood at the edge of the prairie, looking toward the distant hills where golden light met the morning sky. The world stretched endlessly before them, vast and unpredictable, but they faced it together. In the warmth of their connection, they found peace, a quiet joy that neither had known in years of wandering and waiting. Their hands met, fingers entwined, a silent affirmation that this was the life they had chosen, together. In the weeks that followed, the town came alive around them, but their hearts remained focused on the bond they had forged. Friends celebrated their presence, neighbors offered smiles and nods of approval, and the boarding house itself seemed to breathe with renewed vitality. Slowly, dreams long deferred began to take root, a home filled with laughter, a life marked by trust and safety, and the promise of family. Elijah watched Clara one evening as she tended the kitchen garden, the sun casting a warm glow over her hair. He felt the extraordinary weight of ordinary moments, the kind of peace that comes after storms have passed. In that stillness, he recognized the depth of their journey, the trials they had faced, the fears they had overcome, and he understood that every step had led them here, to a quiet certainty, a love that could endure. Began to appear in the wide night sky. They sat on the porch together, the prairie stretching endlessly before them. Their fingers were intertwined, their hearts aligned. The past remained a memory, the future an open horizon. In the soft glow of lantern light, they embraced the simple truth of their lives. They had found home, they had found each other, and in that discovery, they found everything they had been searching for. The quiet night held promise, and for the first time in years, neither feared what was to come. For anyone who has enjoyed witnessing this journey, the hope, the courage, and the tender moments, remember to stay with Dust and Devotion Tales for more stories that warm the heart and stir the soul.